Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmstead. And today's topic is the age of anxiety. Now, this talk is about what happens post World War I. But as always, before we begin, take a moment, jot down the lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. You got it? Let's get started. Now, World War I resulted in the end of the old world order. And in its place, we're going to see the end of the Hohenzollerns in Germany, the Habsburgs in Austria, the Romanovs in Russia. Democracies in Europe remained intact or took root. France and Britain remained democratic. Germany became a democracy, the Weimar Republic, though it was forced. And the new state of Czechoslovakia was democratic. 1920s, however, also saw communist totalitarianism take root in Russia, and fascism would emerge in Italy, and then later in the 1930s in Germany. The political crises of the 1920s were followed by the Great Depression beginning in 1929, and then off into the road of World War II in the 1930s. The New World in the aftermath of World War I created what we refer to as the Age of Anxiety. World War I was a staggering blow to Western civilization. Many people felt that the world they knew had been turned upside down, and they seemingly had little control in changing things for the better. People kind of saw themselves living in a continual crisis that would begin in 1914 and last at least until the early 1950s, and then you start the Cold War immediately thereafter with possible nuclear holocaust. And what we see here as a result of this, all these changes, is we start seeing a change in philosophy, or what we now refer to as modern philosophy. Now, after the war, new and upsetting ideas began to emerge throughout the entire population. Before 1914, people were still kind of filled with the belief of the Enlightenment ideas of progress, reason, and rights of the individual. Optimistic pre-World War I view did result in some significant progress, including like the progressive era of the United States. But critics of the pre-war world anticipated a lot of these post-war ideas and fears. They rejected the general faith in progress and the power of the rational human mind. Among these, one of the most important critics of this was Friedrich Nietzsche, who became one of the most important critics of rationalism of the Enlightenment. In his work, Thus Spake Zarathustra, he blasted religion and famously claimed God is dead, claimed that Christianity embodied a slave morality, which glorified weakness, envy, and mediocrity. Individualism, that is, had been crushed by society. Later in the book Will to Power, 1888, he wrote that only the creativity of a few supermen, the Übermensch, could successfully reorder the world. Though not widely read by his contemporaries, his writings seem particularly relevant in the atmosphere of the post-World War I pessimism. Fascist dictators, such as Hitler, are going to be strongly influenced by his ideas. Additionally, people like Henry Bergson, who in the 1890s convinced many young people that immediate experience and intuition were as important as rational and scientific thinking for understanding reality. Or George Sorel, who taught about syndicalism, a manifestation of anarchism, who believed that socialism would come to power through a great violent strike of all working people. This, of course, foreshadowed the Bolshevik Revolution that was controlled by an elite few. And then, of course, Sigmund Freud, or Freudian psychology. First developed in the late 1880s by Sigmund Freud, But you see, he revolutionized how we perceive and how we conduct psychology. See, traditional psychology assumed that a single, unified, conscious mind processed sensory experiences in a rational, logical way. Freud says, under Freudian psychology, it seemed to reflect the spirit of the early 20th century, with an emphasis on humans as being greedy, irrational creatures. This became an international movement by 1910, receiving popular attention in 1918, especially in Protestant countries of Northern Europe and the United States. Freud asserted that because the human unconscious, the id, is driven by sexual, aggressive, pleasure-seeking desires, humans therefore are not rational. The id battles the ego and superego. That is, the ego, that rationalizing conscious, mediates what a person can do, whereas the superego, ingrained moral values, specify what a person should do. These three areas, the id, ego, superego, are in constant battle, with oftentimes the id winning out due to its irrational, pleasure-seeking, in-the-moment ideas. This shattered the Enlightenment view of rationality and progress. Freud agreed with Nietzsche that mechanisms of rational thinking and traditional moral values can be too strong for the human psyche. They can repress sexual desires too effectively, crippling individuals and entire peoples with guilt and neurotic fears. Many people, and some enthusiasts, interpreted Freud as saying that the first requirement for mental health is an uninhibited sex life. After World War I, the popular interpretation of Freud reflected and encouraged the growing sexual experimentation, particularly among middle-class women. The Roaring Twenties, the Flappers, where women were drinking and smoking, where automobiles allowed women to have a little more freedom to get out from the chaperonage of their parents, who were, stick in the muds, which led to the creation of things like Make Out Mountain or Make Out Point, where people were making out and necking and, of course, having sex. And there are studies in the United States that by the 1930s, half of women were reporting having unmarried, underage sex. A far cry from the stick Victorian morals of their parents. In the post-war era, new philosophers emerged that will expand upon the earlier pessimism, knowing what is known as logical empiricism, or logical positivism. It took root in English-speaking universities, developed by Ludwig Wittgenstein, part of the Vienna Circle in the 1920s and 1930s. It was a philosophy is the only logical clarification of thoughts. Abstract concepts of God, freedom, morality, etc., are senseless, since they can neither be tested by scientific experiments nor demonstrated by logic of mathematics. Only experience is worth analyzing. This was followed up by these anti-utopian authors reflecting this pessimistic, uncertain future, including Oswald Spengler, who in The Decline of the West said that every culture experiences a life cycle of growth and decline. Western civilization, he said, was in its old age, and death was approaching in the form of conquest by Asians. T.S. Eliot, in The Wasteland, depicted a world of growing desolation, some consider the most famous long poem of the 20th century, and Franz Kafka, who portrayed the helpless individuals destroyed by inexplicable, hostile, and surreal forces in both The Trial, The Castle, and The Metamorphosis. This would give way to a new thought known as existentialism that took root in the continental countries of Europe after World War I. World War II. In the wake of the horrors of World War II and the advent of the atomic age, pessimism and hopelessness were expressed by existentialists. Existentialists saw life as absurd, with no inherent meaning. They viewed the world where the individual had to find his own meaning. Most of these existentialists were atheists. They include people like Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote that life had no meaning and that life has no meaning, and that humans just simply exist. He was strongly attracted to communism. And Albert Camus in the center there. Individuals, he said, had to find meaning to life by taking action against those things which they disagree. Protest. One's actions were derived from personal choices that are independent from religion or political ideology. Christian existentialists shared the loneliness and despair of their atheistic existentialist brothers. They stressed that human beings' sinful nature, need for faith in the mystery of God's forgiveness. They believed Christian faith could anchor the individual caught in these troubling times. T.S. Eliot created his work within a perceived traditional Christian framework and advocated for literary allegiance to tradition. But more famously, of course, is George Orwell, who became famous for his dystopian novels, including The Animal Farm, 1945, an allegorical novella of the Russian Revolution, depicting the events leading up to Stalin era in the Soviet Union, where he says, and I quote, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others," unquote. Now, ironically, the same could be said for the founding fathers of the United States. All men are created equal, but some of us have a more privileged equality than others, the poor who couldn't vote or the enslaved. Again, this is not a new concept. And of course, his other more famous work in 1949, 1984. Big Brother, a dictator, in his totalitarian state uses a new kind of language, sophisticated technology, and psychological terror to strip the weak individual of his last shred of human dignity. And as it's very famously said, the last thing they did was oppose truth itself, where they convinced the people that what they perceived with their own eyes was a lie, and they were able to rewrite truth and rewrite reality, the process we now refer to often as gaslighting. Also famous in this area was Ayn Rand, who in 1936 wrote We the Living, who focuses on the struggle between the individual and the state. Her book Anthem, 1938, portraying a dystopian future run by totalitarian governments. 1947, The Fountainhead, that championed individualism, perhaps her reaction to having lived in the Soviet Union's totalitarian society. Her work would be embraced by conservatives the world over as the next step in governmental evolution. But also, not only was it philosophy and literary works that were reflect this dystopian society, but so was science. Science was a major pillar in the late 19th century, supporting Western society's optimistic and rationalistic view of the world. The new physics, however, popularized after World War I, challenged those long-held ideas and led to uncertainty. Max Planck developed the basis of quantum physics in 1900, postulated that matter and energy might be different forms of the same thing. It shook the foundations of 19th century physics that viewed atoms as the stable, basic building blocks of nature. Albert Einstein, 1905, his theory of relativity of time and space challenged traditional forms of Newtonian physics. That matter and energy are interchangeable, and that even a particle of matter contains enormous levels of potential energy. What it does, though, is it creates chaos from the rational order of traditional Newtonian physics. And finally, Werner Heisenberg, whose principle of uncertainty, that it's impossible to know the position and speed of an individual election, and therefore it's impossible to predict its behavior. Heisenberg's principle that dynamics of an experiment alters the state of the subject. In other words, when we conduct these experiments, we are actually altering the state of the subject we are studying, and therefore we cannot conclusively determine the actual outcome and the laws governing that subject. The impact of the new physics was troubling. It seemed strange. It was a whole new universe that we cannot understand or perceive or yet control. The universe was now relative, that depended upon the observer's frame of reference. It was uncertain, undetermined, without stable building blocks. Physics could no longer provide easy, optimistic answers, or, quite that, for any matter, could provide any answers. In this new uncertainty, this new trepidation was also reflected in the arts and entertainment. In painting, Pablo Picasso, one of the most important artists of the early 20th century, developed Cubism that concentrated on complex geometric zigzagging lines and sharply angled overlapping planes, trying to portray all perspectives simultaneously. Guernica, his most famous work, his masterpiece, the huge mural portraying the bombing of the Spanish city by the German Luftwaffe in the Spanish Civil War of 1936, one of the quintessential artworks that depict the Age of Anxiety for its portrayal of suffering, death, in trying to cover all perspectives and yet understanding it can't. Or Dadaism, a nonsensical word that mirrored the post-World War I world that no longer made sense. It attacked the standards of art and behavior, delighting in outrageous product. Led by Marcel Duchamp, who was the leader of this movement, who produced The Fountain in 1917. He took a public bathroom urinal and named it The Fountain as a way of mocking traditional artistic standards. In 1919, he created his piece LHOOQ, where he took a print of Da Vinci's Mona Lisa and painted a mustache on the subject. This also gave way to Surrealism, led by Salvador Dali, one of the most important surrealist artists, who was heavily influenced by Freud's emphasis of dreams. After 1924, he painted a fantastical world of wild dreams and complex symbols, where watches melted and giant metronomes beat time in impossible alien landscapes. His most famous painting, The Persistence of Memory, 1931. And then there's the other big one that seemingly began to alter things, entertainment, with radio and then later movies. So radio was developed during World War I for military purposes. But by 1920, you're getting the first public broadcast radios in both US and Great Britain. And most countries outside the US had a direct control of the radio by the government. And the radio will become useful for propaganda for political purposes, especially in the cases of Italy and Germany under Mussolini and Hitler. But by able to be controlling the message, this sets a situation much like George Orwell talked about, where the government can change the truth and reality by presenting only its point of view by directly reaching into your home via the radio. And then there's the movies. This brand new medium. Movies were first shown in popularity in the late 1890s, but these were mostly kind of naughty peep show type things. But finally, in 1920, we get the first breakout of these silent films led by Charlie Chaplin, who became the king of the silver screen of Hollywood, as he was able to use moving pictures and present entertainment for audiences the world over. However, this also was taken into a new realm when the silent films became talkies, or you had sound to go along with the images, and people actually heard the people on the screen. Most famously, motion pictures, much like radio, became powerful tools of indoctrination and propaganda. Lenin in Russia began to use movies to reinforce his communist vision. But most famously, in 1934, Leni Riefenstahl. She will produce a film known as The Triumph of the Will. It's based on a Nazi party rally in 1934, and if you get the opportunity, go Google it. It's available for free to watch. It is considered a masterpiece in propaganda. And I'll describe the first scene to you, where the movie opens, or the documentary type opens, and it's a crowd of people, of Nazis, Germans, who are waiting for their Führer, Adolf Hitler, to arrive. And the camera pans up, and it's an airplane flying in on the horizon. As it zooms in and begins to land the plane, you see Adolf Hitler in the plane as if he's descending from the heavens. This all-powerful dictator coming down in a plane. A godlike figure riding down to be with mere mortals. And he gets out of the plane and begins to shake hands and greet and parade through the streets as the German people salute him. The Sieg Heil salute. And then the documentary transfers to the actual party rally at Nuremberg, where you hear Hitler speaking, paying homage to the fallen former president of Germany, who died in office, and then Hitler merged the two offices of Chancellor and Dictator to become the Fuhrer. It's a powerful film that was the world over celebrated for its accomplishment, but it becomes this powerful tool by the fascist Nazis to portray the glories of Germany, not just for Germans, but the world over. And in 1934, most of the world is still dealing with the effects of the Great Depression, and Germany's coming out of it almost immediately, thanks to Hitler's reforms. It's looking pretty good. So, all these new things creates uncertainty. Government is using this new media technology, much like government is using social media today to control messaging through various algorithms. And so how do we conclude this? Well, this age was uncertain. It was anxious. There was pessimism in the air. And then when you combine all of this anxiety with the effects of the Great Depression, the world is ripe for World War II, and we know that's coming. So until then, take care, and bye-bye.